Hello, BookTube. I am continuing with my bit-by-bit, almost page-by-page read-through of J.R.R. Tolkien's Lord of the Rings here. We started with The Two Towers. I started with David Wiley and Tony from An Erudite Adventure, and we went through The Two Towers and The Return of the King, and that was easy for me to do in my weird way, because I just decided I would do it chapter by chapter. We're done with chapters now, because we're done with the book. Now, we're in the appendices. We're in the 100 pages of appendices at the end of Lord of the Rings that were briefly famous last year when the news, entertainment news venues of one kind or another were gropingly realizing that the Rings of Power on Amazon had spent $1 billion not for the rights to the Lord of the Rings, but for the rights just to the appendices. And, every cokehead in every studio in all of Los Angeles is saying, what the heck is an appendice? Go and find out what that is. To some terrified underling, tell me what this show is based on. I saw half of the first movie. Is that what it is? So people briefly had to figure out, had to learn that there were appendices to this book and what they are. And what they are is largely undigested notes and background material of Tolkien's for the events undergirding the events in this book, in the actual novel, The Lord of the Rings. In other words, as I said a couple of videos ago, stuff that should not be in this book. It's not part of Lord of the Rings. And putting it in the book after the last chapter very much gives the impression to the unwary reader that they're important to the book. They're not. And since they're 100 pages in microtype, a prospective new reader could look at that and say, I don't think so. I don't think so. I will stick with the new Ellen Hildebrand. Thanks very much. That's a shame. That shouldn't be true. The Lord of the Rings should not be printed with the appendices in the book. There should be a scholarly edition of Lord of the Rings that not only has the appendices, but I say load the pages with footnotes from the letters, from the unfinished tales, from the Silmarillion. Load the book. I can easily picture a scholarly edition of Lord of the Rings that is your one-stop shop for anything that has even the faintest remote echo in the book itself. But then the reader would know. Right? A reader who isn't interested in a scholarly edition of Lord of the Rings wouldn't buy that edition. But they're here, and so we have to deal with them before we get on to a chapter-by-chapter read-through of the Fellowship of the Ring. And the appendix go A through F, and the first appendix is the longest one. And it's called Of Rulers and Men, of Kings and Rulers. And a large chunk of it deals with the island of Numenor, which was the greatest of all mortal man kingdoms in the old world of Tolkien's Legendarium. So long before the events in Middle-earth, there was a star-shaped island to the west of what is now Middle-earth that was home to a massively splendid race of very long-lived men with great armaments, massive, beautiful ships. They themselves were extraordinarily tall and capable. Sea kings out of mythology. And a large chunk of Appendix A tells the story of the gradual corruption and fall of Numenor, including its destruction beneath the waves at the hands, not of Ulmo, the god in Tolkien's mythology of oceans, but rather by Eru Ilúvatar, the god of all gods, the head of all the gods. One of the only rare, I think the only rare action that he takes directly into Middle-earth. We get that story. And there's a lot of it, and I opined in a couple of these videos that would have made great fodder for the first season of Amazon's Rings of Power. But the two showrunners on Amazon's Rings of Power, who had no experience at anything and were handed $1 billion to desecrate a beloved work of literature, had dictates to follow from the studio, from men and women in mirrored sunglasses that they wear 24 hours a day. Inhuman money people from the studio went to those showrunners and said, well, here's $1 billion, and you can use it to fulfill the fever dream of social justice warriors on Twitter all that you want, but we have some requirements. And you might think, if you're the most naive person in the world, you would think those requirements would be excellent casting and fantastic writing and plotting. Nope. Nope. Those weren't, not only were those not priorities, those weren't requirements at all. Instead, the requirements were This needs to merchandise well with the Peter Jackson movies. We want to merchandise the hell out of this thing the way the Peter Jackson movies did, which means that this little story that you're going to tell about fairies and dragons needs to have hobbits and it needs to have wizards. Of course, this story can't have hobbits or wizards. They didn't exist at the time in which this story takes place. I don't know if there was even one conference where either one of those teenage showrunners said to anybody involved, well, you can't actually do that. Right? That's not the material that we have paid $1 billion to adapt explicitly says those things aren't true. So aren't possible in the continuity that we're doing. I doubt that was ever said. But nevertheless, the rise, the splendor, the corruption, and the downfall of that island of Numenor would have been a great story. And it's a large chunk of Appendix A. But there's another large chunk of Appendix A that is about, the reason why it says that it's about kings and rulers is because it's not only about kings. It would ordinarily be about kings, but there's one kind of ruler in the story that's in this appendix who isn't a king. We went over this in The Return of the King. It's the stewards of Gondor, who are rulers in all but name. They come from an ancient lineage. They can be extremely impressive individuals, as we saw with not only Denethor, but also Faramir. They can be virtually supernatural in their abilities. Throwbacks to the greatness, the grandeur of the Numenorians. Aragorn himself is also a throwback to that. These men who are almost more than men in terms of their perception, in terms of their longevity, in terms of their ability, their physical ability, their mental ability, their ability to go toe-to-toe with the forces of evil that are definitely supernatural. Gondor doesn't have kings. It has stewards instead. Its kingship was lost long ago, and Gondor is now waiting for the return of the king. But we're told in this appendix, and it's also pretty clear in The Return of the King, that not many people in Gondor actually believe the king is ever going to return. When the phrase comes up, till the king returns, it's more in the lines of, what would be, the colloquial thing, the colloquial usage here, no offense to any true believers out there, but the colloquial usage now in our world would be until the second coming. If somebody quipped, well, yeah, I'll see that when the second coming happens, what they're saying is never. I'll never see it. And that is the colloquial usage here in this appendix and in The Return of the King, is when people in Gondor say, oh, until the king returns, they mean effectively never, that it's never going to happen. Nevertheless, the stewards are true to their task. They never take on the role of king. We're told in The Return of the King that Boromir, the son of Denethor, the one we meet in the Fellowship of the Ring, was impatient with that whole idea. I thought, well, the king is not going to come back. Why don't we call ourselves kings instead of stewards? Why don't we sit on a throne, sitting out of a chair below the throne? And his own father, Denethor, says, no, we have a sacred trust. We must hold this kingdom for the return of the king. That's why we get a lot of stuff about Gondor in the rest of Appendix A, a lot of stuff. And there are stewards galore in here. So you have to sort of have an accounting for both. And there are two main takeaways from Appendix A. We're going to dispense with Appendix A today, rather than linger on it too long. It's a long thing. It's full of compacted stories. There's a brief interlude in Appendix A referring to the war of dwarves and orcs. A protracted war that dwarves and orcs fought. We get exactly one short paragraph about it. And that's all. As you saw from the last video, we get 2 or 3 paragraphs about a major war between men and elves, and who knows who else, maybe some dwarfs, maybe others, and the Witch King of Angmar. It's an epic story. And we get it in a few paragraphs, and then it's over. The war of orcs and dwarfs is over in 1 paragraph. No details at all about who took part, what back and forth there was, what heroism there was. We get all sorts of stuff like that. As I mentioned in my last video, that is the way to read the appendices if you're of a mind to, is to read them wondering what stories Tolkien would have made out of them. And that is one of the things that we get, one of the takeaways that we get from the back half of Appendix A that we're talking about today, which is that Appendix A, in one chunk of its length, has an example of an occasion where in his notes, in his preparatory material, all this uncollected stuff that Tolkien insisted on being in the book, There is a segment in this appendix where Tolkien does write a bit of it as narrative, exactly as you would encounter it in The Lord of the Rings. And we obviously couldn't figure out a way to put this in The Lord of the Rings, and I can understand why. But I wanted to read you a bit of it because it's very good, and it does not require the tactic that I was talking about last time about sort of reading between the lines to figure out what narrative story Tolkien would tell. Instead, it is a narrative story, and it involves the end of Aragorn's life, a character that we meet in the Fellowship of the Ring. We see him all throughout the book, and we see him eventually become King Elisar, the king of Gondor and Arnor, the mightiest king of the Third Age or the Fourth Age, the king who introduces the Fourth Age. And he marries Arwen, the daughter of Elrond, to form a human-elven bond, only the third one that's ever been, unless your two teenage showrunners for Rings of Power decide to introduce another one for diversity checkpoint. But we have reached the very end of Aragorn's life. He's well over 200 years old, which is the Dunedain, the descendants of the Numenorians, have an extra long lifespan, but that's still very long, even for them. And they have one other gift. These old blood Numenorians have one other gift, which is that they can decide to die. They have the gift of men. They are mortal. They do not live forever. So elves don't have the decision. They can't make the decision to die, but they can make the decision to take ship to the west and just leave Middle-earth, leave the mortal realm completely. Men can't do that, but they can. These men, these Numenorians, can decide to die. It's an act of will. And Aragorn tells his wife, Arwen, Lady Undomiel, that he has made that decision. That it's time now. His son is grown to full manhood. It's time for him to go. And there's a wonderful scene that Tolkien writes out. I want to read you just a bit of it. Lady Undomiel, said Aragorn, the hour is indeed hard, yet it was made even in that day when we met under the white birches in the garden of Elrond, where now none walk. Tossed off little phrase there, but that means Rivendell is abandoned. Now that Elrond is gone, no one's there anymore. What an amazing thing. What an amazing thing. No elves are there. No one settles. No one wanders there. But anyway, on the hill of Cairn Amroth, where we forsook both the shadow and the twilight, this doom we accepted. Take counsel with yourself, beloved, and ask whether you would indeed have me wait until I wither and fall from my high seat, unmanned and witless. So Aragorn is making this choice to die rather than become feeble and senile. Perfectly acceptable choice, but pretty brutal. It's pretty brutal. Nay, lady, I am the last of the Numenorians and the latest king of the elder days, and to me has been given not only a span thrice that of men of Middle-earth, but also the grace to go at my will and give back the gift. Now, therefore, I will sleep. I speak no comfort to you, for there is no comfort from such pain within the circles of the world. The uttermost choice is before you, to repent and go to the havens and bear away into the west the memory of our day together that shall be there evergreen, but never more than memory, or else to abide the doom of men. Repent is an interesting word there. It seems to imply that Aragorn thinks that Arwen's choice to adopt a mortal lifespan was a mistake. But anyway, she responds to him. Nay, dear lord, she said, that choice is long over. There is now no ship that will bear me hence, and I must indeed abide the doom of men, whether I will or nill, the loss and the silence. That's a little bit of an odd thing to say. We are told that Círdan the shipwright stays in the havens until the very last person who needs the services to go west has come to visit him, which is certainly not now. Círdan is still there. It's odd that she would say this, except she knows the decision she's made. She's mortal. So it wouldn't matter if she took ship to the Undying Lands. She would still age and die. But I say to you, king of the Numenorians, that's rather arch. That's either playful or a little scornful. She's calling her husband the king of the Numenorians. I say to you, king of the Numenorians, not till now have I understood the tale of your people and their fall. As wicked fools I scorned them, but I pity them at last. For it is indeed, as the Eldar say, the gift of the one to men it is bitter to receive. Eru Ilúvatar, the one, gives men the gift of death. So it seems, he said, but let us not be overthrown at the final test, who of old renounced the shadow and the ring. In sorrow we must go, but not in despair. Behold, we are not bound forever to the circles of the world, and beyond them is more than memory. Farewell. Estelle, Estelle, she cried. That's the name that she knew him by, that she originally knew him by decades and decades ago. She cried, and with that, even as he took her hand and kissed it, he fell into sleep. Then a great beauty was revealed in him, so that all who after came there looked on him in wonder. For they saw that grace of his youth, and the valor of his manhood, and the wisdom and majesty of his age were blended together. And long there he lay, an image of splendor of the kings of men, in glory undimmed before the breaking of the world. But Arwen went forth from the house, and the light of her eyes was quenched, and it seemed to her people that she had become cold and gray as nightfall in winter that comes without a star. Her name is Evenstar. Right? So, then she said farewell to Eldarion and to her daughters. Eldarion is her son, the heir of Gondor, and to her daughters, who of course don't get named, and to all whom she loved. And she went out from the city of Minas Tirith and passed away to the land of Lorien, and there dwelt alone under the fading trees until winter came. Galadriel had passed away, and Celeborn was also gone, and the land was silent. So there's no one in Lothlorien either. Galadriel has gone west. She has taken ship to the Undying Lands. And Celeborn, notice Celeborn is not there because he's in Mirkwood with Thranduil. He doesn't appear to have gone to the west himself. But all those rapturous, beautiful chapters in Lothlorien that we saw, no one's there anymore. The Mirror of Galadriel has weeds growing in it. Those platforms, those flets high in the trees, they're all abandoned. There at last, when the Malorn leaves were falling, but spring was not yet come, she laid herself to rest on Cairn Amroth, and there in her is her green grave, until the world is changed, and all the days of her life are utterly forgotten by men that come after, and Elenor and Nephrodil bloom no more east of the sea. Here ends this tale, as it has come to us from the south, and with the passing of Evenstar, no more is said in this book of the days of old. And that is one of the things that I want to take from this reading of Appendix A, is that the appendices are not completely empty of Tolkien actually writing narrative. It does occur from time to time. I know I said in my last video that the way to read these things is reading between the lines, reading the bare bones and imagining the story Tolkien would have made of it. But sometimes there are bits and pieces of story from his notes and his supporting material that he did include in the appendices, fleshed out as narrative. Right? That scene that we just talked about, you can easily imagine how that could be rendered in one line, maybe two. Here, it's a scene much like it would be in Lord of the Rings, only it takes a moment's thought to realize that scene could not work in Lord of the Rings. There's nowhere that you could put it. The story has to end with a hobbit. The story has to end with Sam. It can't go on for another 150 years with Aragorn ruling in Gondor, but traveling hither and thither, not really aging as other people age around him, and finally deciding to go, where that story could not be in The Lord of the Rings. Now, as I mentioned, the appendices are a failure on Tolkien's part as a storyteller. He could easily have written a sequel to The Lord of the Rings. Now, he bandied about the idea of writing a sequel, The Return of the Shadow, the return of evil in the world, but that need not be the sequel. He could have written a sequel to the events of Lord of the Rings. He could have given us the next 100 years, with a growing friendship between elves and dwarfs, with the growing might of Gondor and Arnor, with the growing splendor of the buildings that are rebuilt after the war. I bet you could have worked in some drama there. Aragorn, as King Elisar, for instance, gives all sorts of concessions to the men of the East. What if those concessions were a little rocky for the first 100 years? It stands to reason that they would be. There would have been a way to write that book. Tolkien could have written a 200-page book about the reign of King Elisar that ended with the scene we just read. He chose not to do that. I think that was a wise decision. His story should, the shape of the story in The Lord of the Rings should be the shape that it has. But he couldn't let go. He couldn't put on his big boy pants and say, well, this thing that I imagined, this story that I love so much, it doesn't work in my book, so it can't go in my book. Instead, he had to have it there in the appendices. So that's one takeaway from Appendix A that I wanted to talk about today, is that occasionally the appendices do flourish into narrative. The other thing that I want to say about Appendix A is made abundantly clear when you reread it. I reread it for this little weird little read through or whatever it is that we're doing, and that is there was a whole lot of conflict in Middle Earth that had nothing to do with Sauron at all. Sauron is either incorporeal, his corporeal body is destroyed in the destruction of Numenor. It takes him a while to grow a new body. He's either incorporeal or he is biding his time in Mordor or in Dol Guldur and not really bothering anyone, keeping a malicious eye on the events of Gondor, but not doing anything. And yet, there's tons of strife in the stories that are recounted in this one appendix. Tons of strife, not only between Gondor and the men of the East, which is nonstop. The strife there, the warfare is nonstop, including warfare conducted by Aragorn under a different name for Gondor. For the steward Denethor, who we meet in The Return of the King, his father, Ecthelion, was bosom buddies with Aragorn under a different name. Aragorn was his foremost military commander and led a very punitive military action against the men of the East, against the men of Umbar. It's an ongoing thing. It goes on for centuries. It's very briefly dealt with in this book, but it goes on for centuries. Men fighting men. Not just Gondor fighting the East, but Gondorians fighting each other. Civil war, or right to the brink of civil war in Gondor. And the only reason that I want to stress that is because I believe that Tolkien's Catholicism very often tempted him to embracing, or at least thinking about the world in terms of his Catholicism's mortal enemy, Manichaeism. I think his Catholicism often leads him to think that all of the evil, lowercase e, in the world is probably caused by evil in the world, uppercase E. That there's this signature living, unified, one-person evil causing all the evil in the world. Gandalf, over and over again in Lord of the Rings, outright says that about Sauron. That this division that we're encountering here, this bickering, is all the work of the enemy. No, it's not. No, it's not at all. And you see that very clearly in this appendix. That the men in Middle-earth don't need Sauron inspiring them to kill each other. They don't need Sauron suborning them to be evil or greedy or treacherous. They are that way anyway. They are that way without him. They are that way when he's not involving himself directly in their affairs. That comes up out loud and clear in this appendix. Which, I mean, I said the appendices aren't important for reading Lord of the Rings, and they aren't. But nevertheless, thinking about that really does make me think about the events in Lord of the Rings, and just how much Sauron is culpable. I mean, he is the bad guy, of course, but did the Corsair fleet in Return of the King, did they really need Sauron to move them to what is made clear in this appendix is their ancestral enemy? No, I don't think so. And also, is Gondor innocent? I'm not meaning to plug this into any kind of blue checkmark Twitter discussion about colonialism, but is Gondor innocent? They don't always seem it in the stories in this appendix. They often seem like aggressors or oppressors. All very interesting. It's only interesting if you're a Tolkien fanatic, except for little narrative scenes like that. That scene is lovely between Aragorn and Arwen. That scene is lovely. The final scene between the two of them. So anyway, that's Appendix A. We're going to move on. We're going to try and get through these appendix without dragging this whole thing down into the weeds. The appendix are interesting. So we'll do Appendix B next time, and then we'll move on from there. This won't take more than a few episodes. We'll do a video for each appendix. I don't think I'll need more than that for any of them. I don't need more than one or two for Appendix A. I don't think I'll need more than one for any of the rest of them. And then we'll move on to Fellowship of the Ring. And then we'll be done with this behemoth little book. So anyway, that's Appendix A, Lord of the Rings. Hope you're, getting something worthwhile out of this. It's odd that in my emails and in my Voxer messages, it's the Tolkien fanatics who are loving these videos the most. That is It's kind of odd, I guess, but I'll take it, definitely, because this is just too much fun to stop. So I'll go on to the next appendix next time, and I will see you then. Thank you, BookTube.